It's really good to be here today presenting the first of two short webinars on sensory processing differences in children with autism. So today we'll be looking at the differences, the sensory processing differences in our children. So first of all, we're just going to have a quick run through of what the 8 senses are. And you're probably all very familiar with the first 5, being sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing, and then some of you may know the next one, some of you may not be quite so familiar with them. So vestibular, proprioception, and interoception. We're going to look at how your child might present in each of those areas. So they may present as being undersensitive, so this is called hyposensitive, or oversensitive, which is hypersensitive. Both of these can affect your child's behaviour, and if they're oversensitive, can cause a sensory overload. Too much sensory information can result in shutdown, meltdown, or withdrawal. So many people with autism have difficulty processing everyday sensory information, and any of those senses can be over or undersensitive, or both at different times. So one day could be oversensitive to something and the next day could be undersensitive. And too much information to the senses can cause anxiety, stress, and even sometimes physical pain. Now, some people with autism have said when it's just too much, they actually feel pain from it. So the sensory differences again that we might see, they may have difficulty filtering sensory information. So they can't filter all the information that's coming to them at the same time. They can't filter them out and it becomes too much. We can generally have all sorts of things going on, and we can just filter out what we don't need to hear or see. But for our children, this can be quite tricky sometimes. Very often they can only cope with one sensory input at a time. And certainly some children I've worked with have said that they can't look and listen at the same time. So they can't look at the person who's speaking to them and listen to what they're saying. And they sometimes don't understand what the sensation is that they're experiencing. So they know that something's not right and they're not feeling right, but it's really difficult for them to be able to attach a meaning to that. There's some really, really good videos which are here, and we'll put the links up for those. They can really give you a good understanding of what it feels like to have those sensory overloads and not being able to filter out the information that you don't need. So all 3 of those videos, sensory overload, can you make it to the end and make it stop, are made by the National Autistic Society. So what kind of things might you see in your child? We're going to run through each of those 8 senses now. So sight, so they may be, if they're undersensitive to sight, they might find it difficult to throw and catch. So they're not getting that feedback as the object's coming towards them, and also connecting small objects together. So you might look at that and think perhaps it's fine motor, but it might be worth looking to see, are they undersensitive to sight because they're not making those connections. And oversensitive, they can be really distracted by a busy environment. If you've got lots and lots of, in a school, lots of displays on the wall, or busy areas, shopping arcades, supermarkets, parties, anything where there's lots of things going on. The lights can seem too bright, and very often you might see your child focusing in on detail, so that as they're desperately trying to block out all the busy things that are around them. And sometimes when they're looking at something, the patterns or the words can appear to move. So sound, they're undersensitive, they might be seeking out noise or making loud noises themselves. And they may not seem to hear what you're saying or some other sounds, or be able to acknowledge them, because they're just not making those connections with those. And if they're oversensitive, then you find again busy areas can be really difficult with all the different sounds that are going on. And one of those videos by the National Autistic Society really shows what that can be like in a shopping arcade. The sounds can be magnified hugely. And I can remember an adult once with autism saying that it was like standing next to those huge speakers you get at concerts. You know, just somebody's voice slightly raised can be like that, especially if they're feeling anxious at the time. And then they can't focus on what you're saying if there are other sounds going on in the background. That there's drilling outside or humming from a light or a radiator or something like that can make it difficult for them to focus, and which means, of course, they can't concentrate on what they're doing. And they may make loud sounds themselves to try and block out the other sounds. I know I've had quite a few people say to me, you know, well, you say that they're oversensitive to sound, but they make a lot of sound themselves. And yeah, that's often the case because they're they're either undersensitive and they're making loud noises because they like it, or they're actually trying to block out some of the other sounds that are around them because it's too much. And taste. So if they're undersensitive, they may be placing all sorts of different objects into their mouth to try and get some sort of feedback from it. Things that you wouldn't normally put in your mouth. And this is called pica, P-I-C-A, if you wanted to look at that in a bit more detail. And that's eating or mouthing non-edible items. So they might put tissues or stones or dirt, and some children even feces. They might like really highly flavoured foods, such as very spicy food, often foods that typically children don't want to eat because they're too highly flavoured. If they are oversensitive to taste, then very often they will only like bland food, or some people say beige food, all the things that are beige that don't have a huge amount of flavour. And the texture of food, they may not like those textures, and they may have a restricted diet. Chewing, I'm just going to go back to that one actually. With the taste, you might have children that chew things quite a lot as well, because they like that texture in their mouth. So touch, they're undersensitive. Again, this is another chewing. They might chew on their clothes. And this can be a sign of anxiety as well, but it can be because they're undersensitive to touch, textile. So they like that chewing feeling, and they might chew the cuffs on their clothes or around the collar. And they sometimes have a high pain threshold. So an injury that would cause a child to be really quite upset, they may not really notice. And I've known that some people have actually broken bones and not made a fuss about it at all because their pain threshold is so high. And they might like deep pressure. They might be craving that really deep pressure, big, deep hugs. And if they're oversensitive, then labels in clothes and the seams in clothes can sometimes cause discomfort. They might not like having their things done to their hair, like it being washed or cut or brushed. They don't like being touched, especially light touch. They may prefer a deeper touch, but light touch they don't like, and that can be painful. I've known children react in a way as though somebody has really hurt them just because they've brushed past them, and that feeling is really quite uncomfortable for them. And some children, you might see they take their shoes and socks off as soon as they're in a place where they can do that, or if they're not in a place where they can do it, roll up their trousers, or they might take their clothes off when they're upset. Because the more upset or the more anxious our children can be, then their sensory sensitivities will be more heightened. So, smell, they're undersensitive. You might see that they don't seem to notice particular smells, some strong smells that most people would be able to smell. If there's a horrible smell about and everybody's saying, oh, what's that smell? And they may not be able to smell it. And because of that, as they get older, sometimes body odour can be a problem if they're not able to smell that. So we have to teach them that we have to keep ourselves clean because of body odour. And they might lick things to get a better sense of what they are. So they can't smell them in the same way that we can. So they lick them. So if you've got a child that goes up to things and licks them, they're trying to get a better sense of what they actually are. Or if they're oversensitive to smell, you might see that they react to some smells and they're really overpowering towards them. So if they're going in particular shops that have smells, like with bakeries or fishmongers or something like that, or people that wear in particular perfumes, or if they smoke, or even the washing powder on their clothes can cause them not to be able to concentrate. And some children find it really difficult to eat at the same table as others if they're eating different foods to them that have strong smells. And you sometimes see this quite a lot in schools, where some children with autism really find it difficult to be in that lunch hall with all those different smells all over the place. And then we move on to the three lesser known. So vestibular, which is our balance. So it provides us with our sense of balance, and this is what this helps us with our gross and fine motor skills. And the vestibular part of the senses is where we coordinate both sides of our body to be able to do things, which is called bilateral coordination. So if they're undersensitive to this, you may see them seeking out needing this feeling. So you might see a lot of rocking or swinging or spinning. They might spin and spin and spin for ages without getting dizzy at all, or might be rocking themselves or wanting to go on swings, roundabouts, all of those kind of things. And they're the real thrill seekers, the jumpers and the climbers that don't seem to have any fear, and they just want to get that feeling. And if they're oversensitive, this is where you might see children that suffer from car sickness. They have difficulties with sport, being able to control those movements. Find it difficult to focus if their feet are off the floor. So because their feet aren't touching the floor, they're not able to ground themselves. So they find it difficult then to be able to focus, particularly in school. And then proprioception, which is our body awareness, and it's our positioning sense, so how we position ourselves. And we just do this without really thinking about it, unless of course you have some differences around this. So you might see people bumping into things, and people or fidget, they sit and fidget a lot. They're unaware of their personal space and other people's personal space. And they might lean against people and have a weak grasp. So if they hold something, they might drop it. Or if they're learning to write, their handwriting is really light, where they're not able to hold the pencil firmly. And they like rough and tumble play as well. They seek out that kind of play. And sometimes you see children touching walls and things as they walk past them, to try and get some sense of where their body is within that area. If they're oversensitive here, the fine motor skills can be difficult for them, and they might move their whole body, so they're not able to sort of split different parts of their body, so they move the whole body instead of just their head to look at something. And they may be a bit heavy-handed and break things or hurt people without wanting to, without meaning to, but they're not aware of how heavy-handed they are. And their grasp is a lot firmer here, sometimes too firm, and that's how they can hurt people or break things. And they can use too much pressure when writing. So you might see that really pressured handwriting where they're holding the pencil really hard and pressing it on the paper. And they might have difficulties with their doing up buttons and shoelaces. So this This is where you know where your body parts are without needing to look at them. So we just know that. But for children that have difficulties around this, they're not getting that same feeling. It's a bit like if you have pins and needles or your arm or your leg goes dead and you can't really feel it. You know you need to try and move it, but you can't really feel it. And this sense is closely related to the tactile, so the touch, and the vestibular system. So interoception, which hasn't been talked about very much, but it's becoming a little bit more known about, and there's a lot more research on this, and you know, we realise that this can be quite an issue for a lot of our children with autism, which this is the sense that enables us to feel those internal feelings. So hunger, be it whether you're hungry or if you're full. So you might have a child that, first of all, doesn't ever want to eat because they don't get that feeling of hunger, or they never want to stop eating because they don't get the feeling of fullness. And then that's the same with thirst. They may not drink, and you may have to keep nagging them to drink because they don't get that feeling of thirst. Nausea, or needing the toilet. You might have toilet accidents because they don't get that feeling that they need to go. So when it happens, it just happens. Pain, so this is linked to this sense as well. Cold and feeling hot. So again, you might see children with in the winter just wanting to wear shorts and t-shirts, don't seem to feel the cold. And then in the summer, you might get some children that want to wear sweatshirts or coats all the time because they don't seem to feel hot. And it can cause difficulties with being able to self-regulate. So that's a brief look at all of those senses, just to help you try and understand some of those behaviours that you might see within your child. And so how does knowing this help? You might be thinking, well, okay, so if they've got difficulties, how can that help me? It can help you when you're analysing behaviours that you might see. And if you joined us for our webinar on analysing behaviour, we talked about the iceberg and the ABC. So when you're trying to analyse the tip of the iceberg, so what behaviours you're seeing with your child, trying to work out the reasons why, then it could be one of those senses or a combination of a few of them. So it's looking at those sensory sensitivities amongst other areas to work out their behaviour. Helps you to understand why they might be behaving like that. So if every time you get to a certain aisle in the supermarket, your child has a meltdown or runs off screaming, you know, you can start to look at, well, what is it about that aisle? And be able to plan ahead. So once you find out what it is, you can plan. They find this difficult, so I can prepare them for that, or start to desensitize them around that area. And we'll be looking at those kinds of things in the next webinar. So helping others to understand, so it helps other people understand why your child might be behaving in a particular way, and you can inform schools or family members why that's happening. And it can also help your child to understand, because they may not realise that they're reacting in that way because of a sensory need. So sensory sensitivities are really, really important, and it's really been, from all the research around autism now, you know, it's now on the diagnostic procedures as well. So it's a lot of people have sensory sensitivities. Okay, so as I said, that was a brief look at all of those senses. The next webinar, which is in 2 weeks, we'll look at some ways of supporting those sensory sensitivities, those sensory differences. So we'll look at some different strategies that you can try with your child.